Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Today I'll be speaking with Professor Terri Moyers, who is a legend in the world of motivational interviewing. She's a very humble person, and she might cringe at the thought of me referring to her like that. But she's been at the forefront of motivational interviewing research, especially to do with the role of client language, change talk and sustained talk, and predicting outcomes and behavioral changes. So she has a long list of research publications. But she's also heavily involved in motivational interviewing training. In fact, my Training New Trainers workshop way back in 2007 was facilitated by Terri and also Professor Bill Miller. Today, Terri and I are speaking about a more recent publication, a book that she co-wrote with Bill Miller titled Effective Psychotherapists, Clinical Skills that Improve Client Outcomes. Such a great book for therapists who would like to just increase their effectiveness, even just a little bit. It covers topics such as accurate empathy, acceptance, positive regard, genuineness, focus, hope, evocation, and offering information and advice. We cover all of that in our conversation, as well as where might compassion fit in. Her answer might surprise you, and so I bring you Professor Terri Moyers. Well, Terri Moyers, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you, Stan. What a great name for a podcast.
Yeah. No, it's great to see you. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you about your recent book with Professor Bill Miller, Effective Psychotherapists, Clinical Skills that Improve Client Outcomes. I suppose my first question is, what is an effective psychotherapist? In other words, the effective bit, I guess, was what I was curious about to begin with. What would you say there?
Well, now I'm a little bit of a hardliner on this, which is that to me, an effective psychotherapist is somebody that when you follow their clients or their patients or whatever word you would use, the people that they're trying to help, they get better, and instead of worse, and instead of staying the same. So an effective therapist is one that there is some measurable change in their client's functioning after they have had therapy with this person. And of course, the whether or not a therapist is effective used to actually be a nuisance variable, right? We didn't like to have variability in therapists because we thought the most important thing was to test out the methods that they were using, the actual therapy. So like if you want to test out, behavior therapy for anxiety, so exposure and response prevention, for example, well, a therapist variability is a nuisance because it messes up or makes it too noisy for you to detect the signal for the effectiveness of your treatment. But if you turn that on its head and you say, wait a minute, what if that therapist variability is actually what's interesting to us? And we just studied therapists. You can see that there really is variability in therapists, and that's what a therapist effect is, right? No matter what your outcome variable is, if you look at a bunch of therapists, some will have better outcomes than others. And often the spread in therapist outcomes is shocking. It's just really, really surprising how much difference there can be in the client outcomes just based on the therapist that they happen to be assigned to in a clinical trial or in a real world setting, in a health organization of some kind. So anyway, that's what I mean by an effective therapist, is one that has a beneficial impact on their client's functioning, or at least is associated with improvements in their clients. And that's really the research that we have.
Not all therapists are the same, kind of thing, and in lots of
Absolutely
ways.
not.
Yes.
Right. And that's called the uniformity myth, right? That
Mm.
therapists are all the same and they sort of do the same things and they have the same impact. Nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, therapists are more different than they are alike in their impact on their clients.
And there's more variability between therapists than there is between approaches in a way as well. It's sort of,
Well, so a different way to say that is often the therapist effects are larger than the treatment effects. So if you look at, okay, how much variance is explained by the treatment as opposed to the therapist, it's often the fact that therapists have triple the amount of variance accounted for than the treatment that the person was assigned to. So which therapist they got turns out to be more closely associated with their outcome than which treatment they got. And that's extremely annoying to people who are doing treatment outcome research, but it's very interesting to me.
just as a slight sort of side note on that, when it comes to motivational interviewing, is that thought to be an even greater difference there amongst therapists, or is that not so much the case these days in the research that motivational interviewing is more different across therapists than perhaps other approaches?
So I think the only research that's been done to address that was actually done by I think Chris Dunn was part of that study, and the other names are escaping me now. But yes, the MI therapists were different from each other. But even more interesting is that they were different within the clients that they were seeing. So you would think that somebody who's good at motivational interviewing would be good with all the people that they see. But I believe this study showed that MI therapists, just like other kinds of therapists, really vary in how good they are depending on which client is across from them.
Okay, so that's very interesting. That one element of effectiveness is effectiveness of the therapist compared with other therapists, and in terms of the
Mhm.
overall outcomes they're getting with their clients. But the other element of effectiveness is how we can bring all of our
Yep.
clients into a sort of
Right.
an effectiveness range. And
Right.
yeah.
So one way to look at therapists is to compare them across with each other. And those are called between effects, between therapist effects. But another way of examining therapists is to look at how they are with all their own clients in their own caseload. And that's called within therapist effects. And so you can look at, how therapists vary in each of those circumstances.
In our practice, we use the DAS-10, the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale, with 10 items, which was developed by some dear friends and colleagues of mine, Kim Halford and Aaron Frost. And so we give our clients the DAS-10 every session sort of thing, and try to
Oh my
track
goodness.
outcome, that way to see, are people improving? And we have nice graphs that are generated, and we can sort of see just as an overall psychological distress kind of measure whether people are
Yes.
improving.
That puts you right on the cutting edge of practice.
Mm.
Uh,
And it is very interesting. Just getting the feedback kind of helps, I think, because we can look at it from session to session and think, oh, okay, the person has actually gotten a bit worse this week. What might
yeah.
we do about that? Do we need to change something, and so on?
Yeah. In our training clinic, we likewise use a sort of a symptom inventory for an SCL, a symptom inventory for patients, and as they come
Mm.
in every week. And um, so a couple of things. One is, it sounds like such an easy thing to do and such a great idea, and it is. It obviously is. But boy, do patients ever get sick of filling out those inventories, right? Because it's the same thing every week, and so you have to kind of factor that in. It's something you don't read about in the empirical literature, right? Like, you need to get data about your patients every week, but no, taking that assessment every week isn't necessarily such a happy experience for them. And the
Yeah.
other thing is we found is you actually have to look at the inventory before you sit down to do the session, right? If you take the assessment, if you do the assessment, then you have to have the discipline to sit down and review that before you actually go into the session. So
Yeah.
several times we noticed that there was a change, but only after the session was complete. So
Yeah. Actually, those 2 points relate directly to each other, I think. If
yeah,
you do look at the measure and you communicate that with the client and you
yes,
explore that and so on, then even for them, it makes it worthwhile to spend those couple of minutes to actually
Yes,
fill it out. So I think that is
yes,
the key, really, is those two
good
points.
point.
Yeah.
And you said you have 10 items in your inventory?
It's a 10-item measure. It's a sort of a shortened depression and anxiety and stress scale. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other one we used to use was the ORS, the Outcome Rating Scale, which is the Scott
Yes.
Miller et al. Sort
Yes.
of one. It's more of a putting a mark on a 10-centimeter line for 4 items, which
Right.
I quite liked as well. But I like there's a bit more specificity in the DAS-10 because it does have an anxiety and a depression kind of subscale that we can track
And
as
have you
well.
published it?
Well, that was developed by Aaron and Kim, and they've published it. Yeah, it's
Excellent. Well, you
definitely
maybe
out
you
there.
could include a link in
I'll
the
include a
show
link to
notes
that
of
one,
this.
actually.
Yeah, so that
Yes,
people
and
can explore that more if they're interested.
absolutely, it's quite handy, and it is also available on certain online psychometric assessment platforms as well, which is how you get the lovely
Nice,
graphs and things like that.
nice, nice.
So, what is it that you've discovered helps people to improve their effectiveness, I guess? So where would you begin with that?
Well, so what I would say is we're sort of in the beginning of exploring what makes therapists effective. In some ways, this is a really old literature that people have been talking about and thinking about for a long time. But in other ways, the research in this area is a little bit behind. And it's just recently that we've been starting to have some of these big data studies where they look at 10,000 therapists, or I'm sorry, they look at 2,500 therapists that have thousands and thousands and thousands of clients where they can pick up some of these really robust effects. But still, all that data is associational, right? We don't yet have studies in which we say, okay, here's therapists that are like this, and here's therapists that are like this, and let's randomly assign our clients to these two different kinds of therapists and keep the treatment the same and see what the outcome is. We're really not there yet. And I hope we'll get there. And the thing that I can think of first that I would explore first is in a situation like that is empathy, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think we're not at the point where we've begun to explore therapist effects seriously. All that to say, the things that we've picked out, that Bill and I picked out, were the therapist characteristics that were most carefully explored and where the correlations were highest with outcomes. And again, I say the word correlation. These are things that are associated with better outcomes, but we can't say that they cause better outcomes, right? And that's important. That's an
Okay.
important distinction to make.
I haven't thought of it like that, but yes, empathy, for example, has long been thought to be, very important and so on, but it's an association rather than something more longitudinal or something that you can study kind of. I mean, how would you even determine if a therapist was a high in empathy therapist or a low in
Oh,
empathy
that's the
therapist?
easy part.
That's the easy
That's the
part.
easy
Okay.
part, right? Because you can look at the way a therapist is and you can do ratings. Empathy is something that's actually pretty easy to measure. Well, easy. It's pretty straightforward to measure, and we've done it a lot. And so empathy is something for which there's a pretty substantial body of correlational evidence to indicate that it's important. The hard part is how do you keep the empathy the same across all the clients the therapist will see?
Yes.
Because it changes, right? And
Mm.
the level of empathy that is present changes depending on the client that's there. And even with some clients from session to session.
Mm.
Still, you would ideally be able to, and you would be able to take account of all that variability and still see the signal of the therapist's empathy with the client's outcome and their better outcomes.
Is it measured behaviorally in the therapist? Is it measured in terms of the therapist's perspective? Is it measured from the client's perspective?
Well, so you can measure empathy from all three of those perspectives,
Right.
and you can measure the one I'm most familiar with is the objective rater, right? The person who just sits down and objectively rates. And You can measure empathy using large global scales, like how empathic was the therapist. We measure empathy as the ability to understand the client's perspective and to convey that. So we measure it both in a global and we measure it in reflections
Mm-hmm.
and the quality of the person's reflective listening. And you can create regression equations where you put both of those variables in to, come up with a measure of empathy. Other people measure it in using different definitions but they're all sort of in the same ballpark. Where you get into trouble is if you try to measure empathy in a way that encompasses sympathy, because that really is a different construct, and maybe sharing a more territory with compassion, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, you can also measure empathy from the client's perspective. How much did my therapist understand me in this session? And you can measure it from the therapist's perspective. How much did I convey my understanding of the client's perspective in this session?
Oh,
But
that's
what we
interesting.
haven't done, and I'll just circle around to this, what we haven't
Yeah.
done yet, which I would love to see, is we haven't tried to experimentally manipulate empathy. Right? We haven't said, okay, you people be high empathy therapists and you people be low empathy therapists, and we're going to manipulate that empathy that you express, and we're going to see the impact that that has on the client's outcome. And I would love to see that study done, although I say that with trepidation because lots of people think that that would be an unethical study to do, to manipulate the therapist's empathy, right?
Yes.
So it's a catch-22 because you can't explore experimentally and provide evidence for the value of empathy because we assume already that it's so important then that to offer lower levels would be unethical. So it's sort of interesting.
That is
dilemma.
very interesting. Yeah, it would feel a bit hard to have certain therapists actually purposely be unempathic and see that.
Although, the opposite of empathy isn't coldness, right?
Uh-huh.
It's things like teaching and directing and lots of maybe advice giving, skills building. Those are kind of the opposite of empathy because they're not really trying to gain the person's perspective. They're really trying to do another sort of task which has clinical value, supposed clinical value, right? So,
Well,
I mean,
although in some ways the opposite to empathy is also sort of misunderstanding or sort of getting the emotions wrong or that sort of thing as well.
yes, interesting point. Interesting point, right? So maybe the opposite of empathy is not trying to understand the person's perspective or not focusing on that, but another is misunderstanding, and that would even be interesting research to do, right? Like what happens if you're a therapist that mostly gets it right, do you have a different impact than therapists who mostly get it wrong, right?
Yes.
What the person's saying or thinking.
Yes. Yes, because even advice giving could emerge from an accurate empathy. It's just that the empathy is
Yes.
not expressed. As we'll see in a minute, offering information and advice is a useful
Yeah.
skill of effective psychotherapists. So it's not
We have it in our book.
yeah, it's not
We have it in our book. Yeah.
inherently bad. But so accurate empathy as a therapist skill. What would you say about that?
What I would say is it's the skill for which there is the most evidence in the psychotherapy literature. It is where I would, if I were trying to get better as a therapist, which I'm too old to try to get better as a therapist. I'm heading towards retirement, but if I were a new therapist, brand new in the area, that's where I would put my efforts, right? And I would get very good at reflective listening. And I would also cultivate and nurture my internal curiosity about my clients. I would try to become as curious as I could about them because I think that's one of the things that nurtures empathy is curiosity.
So curiosity is kind of like the somewhat of the driver behind it, and then reflective listening is the expression of it and the way of conveying that empathy to the other
Yes. So
person.
reflective listening is the external skill that you can use to convey empathy. And of course, it's not the only thing that empathy is,
Mm.
right? There's a lot more to empathy than just reflective listening. But boy, reflections are a nice way to be able to measure and give actionable feedback to others or to yourself about how to improve empathy.
Mm.
Well, how to improve your conveying of empathy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the very trainable, learnable, practicable skill of empathy.
I think that's
Um,
right. And I think, there's a limit, I think, well, do I think that's right? Is there a limit? Yeah. I think there are differences, obviously, in therapists about how much empathy they convey. And that's probably based on a natural distribution of that internal component of empathy, that curiosity, right? Like you
mm,
I think that's probably normally distributed in a human population. Some people are born with a lot of curiosity about the internal world of others and what's going on inside of other people. And some people are born with very little of that interest and curiosity innately,
mm,
right? I think we're prepared by evolution as human beings to have some empathy because it helps us survive as a species. But
mm,
like other human talents, I think, and characteristics, it's probably normally distributed.
mm,
So if you find that you have less curiosity than you wish you did,
mm,
then that's where I think you could say to yourself, okay, well, that's where I want to improve. And that's where I think of
mm,
it, your innate capacity you're born with as a rubber band, right? You can have a great big rubber band or you can have a small rubber band, but any rubber band you have, you can stretch.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And it may be that way with a therapist skills, including
mm.
empathy.
And including the external and internal sort of, I think that's the way you're thinking about it. Both of those aspects to it can be practice. We can practice curiosity.
Yes. Yes.
Mm,
And for some people, their empathy expands by having experiences in their life, which
mm,
then cause them to be curious about how other people who have had the same
mm.
experiences have managed.
I'm trying to think what would be little kind of a little grab in terms of how to develop one's curiosity. I suppose just having little questions in mind. What is this person feeling? What is this person meaning? Kind of thing, and just really trying to riff off that a little bit and listen in a way that tries to give attention to those sorts of things.
Yes. And I think having people in your life who are interested in you and
Mm,
who have an investment in you as a human being
mm.
helps to increase your curiosity because someone's curious about you.
Which is really, that's a very profound thought, isn't it, really? That empathy sort of arises out of having been empathized with in a way. And so if
Yes.
we feel heard and understood, and if we feel like people kind of get it kind of about right sort of thing, and we sort of observe the way they do it, then that naturally cultivates that skill within ourselves. And that's important for therapists, but it also, helps with kind of conceptualizing clients as well in terms of how they might struggle with, things like empathy and so on,
Mhm.
depending on their backgrounds as well.
I can't really talk about this without reflecting on what it was like to have Bill Miller as a supervisor and a trainer.
Yes.
And I I wonder what a kind of a therapist I would have been without the teaching and the attention and the um, focus on
Yes.
empathy and how I felt that for myself, not
Ah.
just as a demand for me to have for other people, for my
Mm.
clients.
Yes, it gave me little shivers when you said that, just to imagine what that must have been like, the hours and hours that you would have spent together.
Mhm.
Um, I was fortunate enough, you may remember, being trained by you and Bill in Chicago in 2007.
Chicago, yes, I think
At
Helen Mentha was there too, wasn't she?
Helen Mentha was there as
Yes,
well, and
yes,
Margot as well was
yes.
there, and many others. And so I had the sort of the 1-2 punch of accurate empathy from both of you. And the interesting thing about that I often reflect on, because I often have watched your videos and Bill's videos, is that you actually are also sort of different in the way you do it too. You know, like there's no one way to be empathic. And Bill's style is one sort of a way, and your style is sort of, you know, unique too. And yet there you are, both, you know, very skillfully empathizing with the clients. So I've always found that reassuring. You know, we don't all have to be like Bill, for example. We can be like Terri, or we can be, you know, ourselves.
Well, you've hit on something so important, and this is actually germane to another skill that we included in the book,
Mm.
which is genuineness and
Ah.
the importance and value of genuineness as a therapist interpersonal skill. And we almost didn't put this skill in the book. We almost had 7 skills, and we debated, should we put genuineness in, because the empirical research for genuineness is pretty thin, really, compared to the other kinds of skills. And one of the problems is defining it, right?
Yeah.
It's not as easy to define as empathy or acceptance. It's just
Mm.
much harder to pin down. But we were compelled about the value of including it when we started to think about how it relates to the other skills. So, for example, if you are empathic, but you are perceived as not being genuine, well, then what value does your empathy have for your client, right? If you are being accepting but not genuine, is that really of value to your client? So we decided that
Mm.
genuineness was something that was so important that we couldn't leave it out, and
Mm.
we had to include it. And I think what you're talking about in the difference between Bill and I, and really if any 2 people who sit down
Mm.
who are using motivational interviewing, for example, there are going to be just differences in the way they do things. And to the extent that they're both genuine, then they're probably going to both be fine.
Mm. Yes.
Now,
No,
I want
that's
to take that back, because I think you could be genuinely a jerk in the way you offer treatments as well, right? So
yes.
yeah, that might not actually be right, what I just said.
Well, I think the point though is that in some ways the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, or something. You know, that all of these
Mm.
8 skills together are, you know, sort of more than you can't. You also couldn't really just be empathic without, you know, positive
Correct.
regard or some sort of focus, or, you know, those sorts of things. And so
Well, and
um,
I think, you can go wrong by offering so much empathy and ignoring some of the other skills. And, and that probably varies across clients as well. Some clients
mm.
need a lot of empathy, and some clients might be disturbed by it.
You mentioned acceptance there too. That's
Mhm.
another one of the skills. How are you defining that one?
Non-judgmentalness is the way
Mm.
that accepting becomes operationalized, right? Is
Mm.
not having judgments of your clients. And that has to do with your worldview and how you view people and how you view your clients. And you can view your clients as unmotivated and resistant and fighting you every step of the way and being unwilling to admit or face up to their problems. And that's going to cause one kind of way of being with the person. Or you can view them as being inherently motivated and somehow stuck and having in them a drive towards health and flourishing, and your job is to help draw that out and spark that. And it's going to give you a different way of viewing your clients. And
Mm.
so acceptance, really the internal component of acceptance, has a lot to do with your worldview
Mm.
of your clients dilemmas,
Mm.
their problems.
Your worldview, and yes, really an awareness of that, isn't it? That's
Mm-hmm.
one of the internal sort of aspects to the skill, is just that self-awareness, I suppose, and knowing
Mm-hmm.
one's own kind of values, maybe, or because sometimes our clients might be doing things that are sort of against our values or something like that. But
Mhm.
maybe we have certain biases too that aren't quite so, we might not feel so good about, but they lurk there, these sort of maybe even unconscious biases or that sort of thing. So
Right.
self-awareness is kind of key behind acceptance, a bit like curiosity is behind empathy.
Yeah. And your ability to say to yourself, what's keeping me from viewing this person in this way that I can view other people that's helpful, right? What's
Mm.
keeping me from doing that?
I suppose it's interesting non-judgment, because I suppose we're still making little judgment calls in amongst that. It's I suppose it's more of being judgmental in that more critical, blaming, shaming sort of judgment, even if we might
Well,
need to kind of,
I think being accepting doesn't mean that you agree with everything the client says or does, or that
okay.
you have to express agreement. Being accepting doesn't mean that you can't disagree with your client, because it's not everything about your client that you have to accept.
Mm.
But you have to accept their inherent worth as a human being, and their
Yes.
ability to be separate and different than you are.
The other one in the sort of the first four of the book is positive regard, and it is interesting to think about things like empathy and acceptance and positive regard and genuineness. That does sound very Carl Rogers in a way, I
Mhm.
suppose. And so,
Well,
like,
absolutely. You're totally right there. I mean, and we say that very explicitly in the book. And Bill, I think, has said that very explicitly about motivational interviewing, that it rests on a Rogerian foundation.
it's interesting because that's what you were saying right at the start, that a number of these have a long history to them now, that we've sort of known about or talked about or theorized the importance of these kind of skills or characteristics, even though something like genuineness, for example, it's a bit hard to pin down, it's a bit hard to
Right.
define, and yet there's this intuitive sense that these are key. But also, by the sounds of it, a growing body of research, which is really supporting all of that.
I think
Oh,
people should be a lot more interested in therapist skills and doing a lot more research,
mm.
but they are doing so.
Yeah. So as a therapist, how might I sort of identify and practice my positive regard towards my clients?
The skill that we have in the book that we talk about is affirmation.
Ah,
So every person who that's the sort of external skill. Every person who sits in front of you will have some strengths and some weaknesses, right? And so positive regard is about putting your mind towards understanding their strengths and not only their weaknesses, right? So motivational interviewing is relatively unusual in therapeutic approaches, such that it does not require a uh, a way of understanding the person's pathology before you can help them get better. So if you look at CBT, for example, or DBT, or exposure or behavior therapy, any of those kinds of treatments, it's like I have to understand how the person became pathological in order to use the therapy method. Those two are inherently related. And in
mm,
motivational interviewing, you don't have that
mm,
relationship, right? In MI, you can sit down and you can be helpful to a person without not necessarily knowing how they develop their pathology, because you're not trying to tell them how to get better. You're really trying to help them become motivated to get better, right?
mm, mm,
So, positive regard is a lot about, can you, as a practitioner, pay attention to those strengths and help the person to identify what those are and how they can use them to get better, to get more of what they want.
mm,
And so much of our treatment, our formal treatment, is really about identifying pathology and identifying what's wrong with people, that we forget sometimes to pay attention to what's right about them, and
mm.
to always have, I think it's Steve Rolnick who calls them strengths based glasses. I'm wearing my
Oh,
strength based glasses, and if I've misquoted him, please forgive me, Steve, if I've got that wrong. But
yes.
somebody that I value, um, in my heart said that, and I think it's Steve. And the idea is, can you put on those glasses and wear them when you see your client, and
Mm.
and affirm that, get in the habit of seeing that and affirm that when you find it.
Motivational interviewing doesn't really have a formulation-based approach, I guess, is what you're saying. We don't do a formulation to try to sort of understand the origins of the psychopathology or something like that. Rather, it begins with what would you like to change, I suppose, or something like that. And so being able to have on the strength-based glasses, which is tricky to say, actually, but it sort
Yes, it
of
is.
makes complete sense. That we sort of are with our clients, and we sort of observe them through a certain lens where we're able to pick up on these strengths and positive qualities and characteristics that really actually might help them change too. That might be
Right.
part of what helps them to actually make the changes they'd like to make.
Right. And that what got you in trouble isn't necessarily gonna be what I need to know to help you get better.
But in amongst all of that, I guess we also need a focus, something that we're, kind of perhaps focusing on or working towards, or something, some sort of direction. I've always really appreciated that distinction between being directive, being non-directive, and being directional, I guess, and trying to have
Mhm.
some sort of focus in the work that we're doing.
Right. And I think that that skill in therapists is very clearly, if you're wandering too much and you never are working towards an outcome, a particular outcome that you have in mind, it doesn't bode well, right?
Mm.
Being non-directive doesn't necessarily bode well. Even if that's a real thing that you could do, which I'm not convinced, it's not associated with better outcomes.
But rather having some kind of focus. Hope. It's this is an interesting one. I was talking to a person just yesterday, and they were feeling very stuck on the idea that am I just being foolish to hope that things will get better? And it was I was kind of formulating it a little bit, I must admit. I was seeing it as part of what is a very self-critical style anyway, and so the self-criticism is sort of has been there for a long time, and so I'm being a fool kind of related a bit to that. I was trying to cultivate hope, which I guess is the eighth or so skill in the book,
Yes,
and
yes.
I just was really curious about how this particular man sort of snapped back with the idea that hope is foolish. We then had a big chat about things like false hope, and we tried to disentangle, I guess, a hopefulness from a kind of a false hope or something
Mm.
like that. But he was just sort of quite fearful of hope, I think. I think he was fearful
Yes.
of hoping for something that then didn't happen, perhaps. Or so there was an interesting big conversation, really took a lot of the session, just discussing hope and what we mean by hope and perhaps what it isn't, and how one can sort of hold hope without it being related to a kind of a foolishness or sort of a self-critical thing.
And I'm so used to thinking about um, training that I see
Mm.
this as in a training perspective, right? Like a novice therapist might say, I feel foolish if I hang on to the idea of, or that people will get better when I'm not necessarily doing anything to help them get better. Right.
Mm.
I'm just meeting with them. Like I'm just meeting with them for 4 sessions, or, I'm not giving them advice, and how can I expect them to get better from
Yeah.
that?
Yes, I've
Um,
I've often been in situations where a client and myself come to a little sort of arrangement in a way where I say that I'm happy to hold that hope for us both
yeah.
for a little while, and remain hopeful and remain optimistic. And I think therapist optimism kind of helps with client optimism a bit, doesn't it? In terms of people can maybe dare to be a little bit hopeful too, if their therapist is also, kind of maintaining some hope.
Yes. And I also think there's a reason for therapists to be optimistic. There are some things. First of all, I think there are people who are just sort of innately optimistic, kind of like empathy. I think that, you can have a big optimism rubber band or a small one,
Yeah.
but you can stretch your rubber band
Yeah.
by reminding yourself and by looking at what the world was like before therapists,
Mm.
right? Did people change before there were therapists? Of course they did.
Mm.
Did people, change addictions? Did they change phobias? Did they get better from things before we had therapists? Yes, they did. And do people change now without therapists? Yes, they do. Most people who implement positive changes in their life, even really difficult ones, like stopping drinking, do it by themselves, right? There's a
Mm.
lot of reason to feel optimistic that people have resources in them that will help them make these changes, even though they don't necessarily believe that. Even though your
Mm.
client doesn't necessarily believe that, you can still believe it.
Another great example where the different skills sort of work together, the positive regard gives us a sense of the person's inherent strengths and qualities and things that they can bring to this next challenge, which then helps to maintain that sense of hope that actually they will be able to maybe do this, and we can sort of hold that hope a little bit. And some of the affirmations might also help to cultivate hope for the client as well, that they start to think,
Right,
well, actually, maybe I am a very persistent person or something. They start
exactly.
to own it, and then they start to be more hopeful.
Right. And if your therapist is always noticing what things you're good at and what you do well at and things that you hadn't necessarily thought about or, feel pretty good about being reminded about, that's likely to make you more optimistic. And the same thing happens with therapists, by the way. If you have a
Yeah.
supervisor that's constantly pointing out what you're good at and what you've done well and how you're clever about what you're doing, as well as some of the areas that you need to improve, it sure does make it easier to be optimistic about yourself, right?
Yeah.
in your
Yeah. Great.
in your progress.
I felt a little bit like the skill here that maybe motivational interviewing contributes in particular to is the idea of evocation, the sort of,
Mhm.
and not only evocation in terms of just, the idea of asking questions or open questions, but also the idea of evoking particular kinds of responding, or particular aspects of the client's thinking, namely things like change talk, I guess. And that's obviously an area of um, great contribution from you, is identifying the importance of certain client language and how we can be quite um, sort of purposeful, intentional in the sorts of
Mhm.
things that we evoke.
Mindful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Would you say that MI has, kind of really provided us a lot in terms of that notion of evocation?
I think it's one of the seminal contributions of motivational interviewing to the world of psychotherapy is
Yeah.
the idea that what people say in the session is important and that you can influence what they say in the session and that will have an impact on their progress. And it's the spontaneous production of change talk that matters. It's not, somebody just deciding I'm going to say it and they don't really mean it, or that it doesn't, you can't just say to somebody, stand in front of the mirror and say to yourself, I will not drink, today. But if the person spontaneously says that to you in an interpersonal environment that's rich in the other therapist skills, and they say, I am not going to drink today. I mean, that's a powerful uh, contribution to motivation, and
Yeah.
we should pay attention to that. We should recognize that, and we should focus on that. And a lot of times, a lot of times we don't even recognize it. It goes right by us, and we don't even hear it.
Yes, being able to notice those key statements from clients and then respond evocatively, respond in a way that helps them to, flesh it out and elaborate a bit and explore it for themselves.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the final one, I guess, offering information and advice. But it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because there are certain pitfalls if we leap to offering information and advice when the client's not ready to hear it. But on the other hand, if we never offer information and advice, people are like, well, what do you think I should do? Sort of a thing. So it's another one we're trying to balance.
Yeah. And I think this is where other interpersonal skills become valuable, because, you need judgment, and you need to be able to read the room when you're offering advice and information. And I mean, if you aren't offering it when the client's ready, that's a problem. And if you are offering it when they're not ready, that's also a problem. So you have to hit that sweet spot in the middle, right?
Mm.
And what I often say to therapists I'm training is think of information and advice like, what's a good cultural translation? I don't have one. In the part of the world I'm from, we use chili powder when we're cooking, right? To make
Ah,
things very hot and spicy.
yes.
And so what I say is, when you're cooking and you want to add chili powder, what do you do? What's the smart way to go about it? And the smart way to go about it isn't to say, "Oh, I have here chili powder and I'm just going to, put it in to the stew." No, you first put a little bit and then you let it cook a while and taste it and see if you need more or whether you've got enough. And
Mm.
it's the stew itself that will tell you. It's the same thing with clients. All right. You offer
Mm.
information and advice, and then you see, well, what's the response to that? And that will tell you whether you've gone too far or whether more is needed.
Oh, that's a really helpful sort of metaphor or whatever. That actually, it's we do have chili here, so it
There you
will
go.
ring true. Uh, it almost applies to all of the skills in a way, doesn't it? Whether it be even empathies, we're wanting to sort of express empathy in certain ways, but then we're wanting to
Hmm.
watch
Yes.
watch for the responses. Or some people love affirmations, some people feel more awkward about them, or
Yes.
whatever it might be. It's always sort of just offering a little bit and then seeing how the person responds and being guided by them.
Why that focus on the process that's happening between two people, right? Like, I'm going to do this, and then let me see what the impact is on you. And then what's that impact on me? And then I'm going to do something different based on those two things, right? That
Mm,
just happened. And that sort of paying attention to that ongoing process, that's a skill. That's a real therapist, right?
mm.
Somebody that is tracking that progress through their sessions.
I'm pretty sure it was Bill at our TNT in 2007 who said that our best teacher of MI is the client we're with right
A
now.
client.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what is
Um,
the client doing right now? What was the impact of what I just did on my
yes.
client? And
Yeah.
you can say, well, what you just did isn't that important because it builds up over time and so on. Yes, but start there. Start with
Mm.
what you just did and pay attention to that in the session as it's happening.
So, of course, I'm very interested in compassion as a sort of concept and something, a part of psychotherapy. And so I was interested to see that it wasn't really explicitly mentioned in this particular book. I mean, I suppose it's a different thing, though, in a way. Like if I sort of like to follow Paul Gilbert and his compassion-focused therapy model, and he would actually define compassion as a motivation rather than a skill per se, that there's a number of
Hmm.
skills that we bring to compassion, including things like empathy and sympathy that you mentioned earlier, and non-judgment and acceptance are part of it as well. And there's a number of skills there, but compassion is the motivation to be sensitive to the suffering and kind of committed to trying to help, trying to alleviate that suffering or prevent further suffering. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts there in terms of where compassion fits in for you? Is it somewhere perhaps lurking behind these various skills? Any thoughts?
Um, a couple. One is I get very nervous when we talk about compassion as being something that is a a desirable behavior on the part of therapists. And the reason that makes me
Okay.
nervous is not because I don't think it's important. I do. But I think what I think about the sea of people who are immersed in their work, very busy, have so many demands on them in the environment that where they work, and it just seems hopeless to them if they're told they have to be compassionate, right, in order
Yeah.
to be a good therapist. So it makes me very nervous to to say that I think that that's a, a an indispensable skill for being a good therapist.
Right.
So I'll
Yeah.
start with that. I'll start with that. I think that might be too high a bar for the current reality of what it is to be a therapist. Well, the other part of that is self-compassion, right? Which
Yes.
I know is something that you're very interested in and
Yes.
have done a lot of work in this area. And I've thought a lot about self-compassion, right? Is that a skill that therapists ought to develop? And I think it is, because I think if you think about, okay, well, therapists have compassion. What's the opposite of that? What's the opposite of self-compassion?
Mm.
Um, it's almost like self-hatred, right?
Mm.
Like, is it if you don't have compassion for yourself, then what do you have for yourself? You despise yourself, or you're indifferent to yourself. What kind of a model is that for how you are living your life, and how inspiring will that be? Because there's no question that your clients and your students, other therapists that you're working with, will know that.
Mm.
They'll know that if you're indifferent to your own suffering, if you despise yourself for your own suffering, they will know that. And
Mm.
so I do think that self-compassion is something that I would say is really important to focus on as a therapist.
Mm.
I don't know that asking a therapist to be compassionate for their clients is something that I can ask of
Mm.
the the everyday people that I come into contact with in the work they're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, that's really, and the thing that occurs to me is the kind of the age-old question, what is compassion, I guess, like in terms of that. And sometimes one of the difficulties is that therapists can have some a particular understanding of what they see compassion is, and it is a
Yes,
very high bar. It is
yes,
something that feels more like Mother Teresa or Dalai Lama or someone like that, rather than little old me, in the work that I'm doing. And I suspect when we distill compassion and think about what it kind of really just means, is just a motivation to be helpful rather than
yes.
harmful, I
Eh,
suppose, to try
eh,
to help and to sort of help people suffer less. And it's sort of in a way, it's an inevitable motivation behind things for most therapists, I think, because they do have this basic fundamental intention to be helpful. But the dangers of compassion fatigue, I guess, is sort of almost what you were alluding to there, that people that the weight of it can feel too much sometimes. And so the importance of self-compassion as a kind of a balance to that. May I be helpful rather than harmful to myself, as well.
yes,
And the indifference to one's own suffering, or the even the sort of the way that we can choose to do things that are harmful to us or to ourselves. That's the bit that we're trying to watch as well. The difficulty is things like empathy and acceptance and non-judgment and all of the rest of it. They can sort of be defined and practiced,
Yes.
Compassion is a bit more elusive than that, and sometimes it
That's why it makes
feels,
me nervous.
yeah,
That's
it
why it
feels
makes me
bigger.
nervous. Right. I imagine sitting down with a group of therapists who are working with really, really challenging, difficult clients and being told, trying to imagine myself saying to them, and compassion is really important for you to cultivate for your clients, right? I just feel like I
Yes,
will lose them because they'll say, I can't meet that bar, right? I might be able
yes.
to be empathic. I might try to be accepting, but I can't really be compassionate, right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
I
Yes,
worry about that.
it's almost the word itself, isn't it, that
Yeah.
starts to kind of, well, what it does, and this is something that Paul Gilbert identified, is that it really can trigger off fears, blocks, and resistances. You know, people worry
Yes.
that compassion is going to be too much. In some ways, with especially with a new therapist, you might use words more like, so we're doing all of these skills, and in the background is just an intention to be helpful, and then that's kind of compassion anyway, but it's in a language perhaps that's less kind of overwhelming in that sense.
In a way that I have found to think about compassion that helps me is that my intention is to have this person's interest at the forefront of what I'm doing.
Love
So
it. Yeah.
their well-being is the most important thing that I want to pay attention to in my interaction with them. And that helps me because then when I start to feel nervous, I say, what am I feeling nervous about? Well, that I won't be effective, or that I will be perceived as being not a good therapist, right? It helps me to pay attention to all the other things that might be pushing on me as I'm interacting with that person that aren't necessarily in their best interest.
Which brings us really back to effectiveness, doesn't it, in a way? Like, in a sense, that's it. If I have this kind of compass that's taking me in the direction of health and well-being for people, and keeping their best interests at heart, and working in a way that tries to be helpful for that, then we're trying to be more effective, and we're focusing on these various skills to do so. Well, Terri, that's wonderful. I really appreciate your sort of willingness to spend a bit of time talking through these skills. It's definitely got me thinking next time I'm back in the office, trying to
Me
you know
too.
have a little focus on these various bits and pieces. Just curious to hear what are you up to at the moment, or what are your current projects, or the things you've got on?
Well, Bill and I would like to write another book. We're sort of we're in the beginning stages of that, I would say, still. And we've been kicking around this idea, and I think we've finally come to what we want to write. And the first book was sort of a way of saying, well, therapists matter. They make a difference, right? And here's the evidence to show that they do. And this next book is like, okay, since therapists make a difference, then here's the way we ought to be doing things differently in the way we offer mental health treatment. And so it's really a book more about systems and about the way things ought to change, or could change, really is a better way of saying it. The way things could change to maximize or to leverage therapist effects in treatments. Let me give you an example. So the first session that a person usually has when they go to see a mental health professional, what happens is assessment. And that's based on this model, right? That we have to figure out what the pathology of the person is in order to help them get better. And if we understand that therapists' interpersonal skills can be valuable in engaging that person in the change process, and that is a more valuable contribution than trying to figure out what's wrong with them and how we can use our expert skills and knowledge to help them get better, then we would change the way our first couple of sessions go with our clients. We would change the focus and the priority about what we do.
Hmm.
And that is a direct consequence of paying attention to and leveraging therapist effects.
And the big thing I think that would help with is just simply client retention, trying to
No
reduce
kidding.
dropout. Yeah.
Do you know what the modal number of treatment sessions that are attended by people who are seeking, for example, substance use treatment?
Mm-hmm.
The modal number, the most common number of sessions that are completed. One.
Yeah.
Probably zero is the better number, right? But of those who show up
All right.
and that
Yes.
we actually have contact with, the
Yeah.
most common thing is that they have one session and they go away and don't come back.
And that's got a pretty strong predictive relationship with outcome, I presume.
Yes, it does. And so what I would say is, knowing what we do about therapist effects, we can do better. We can do better than that.
Yes, we're doing the session by session assessment that I mentioned earlier, but we're also really trying to think about client retention actually, and sort of we define dropout as a person coming to one or two sessions, but not the third session, and the percentages on that vary across clinicians and so on. But yeah, that's a really fabulous place to start is what to do in that first session that really fosters engagement and therefore coming back.
Right. So we'd like to write a whole book about
Yeah.
things that we think could be different in our treatment systems and in the way we think about, what therapy really is, that are different when you pay attention to therapist interpersonal skills.
Well, I'll definitely look forward to that one.
Yes.
If people would like to find more about your work or to read your stuff, where can they find you?
Well, the first thing they could do is email me. I mean, I
Okay.
get a lot of email and I answer a lot of email. And
Okay.
my email is tmoyers, TMOYERS, at unm.edu, University of New Mexico.edu. So tmoyers at unm.edu is one way.
Okay.
And another is to, if you're interested in my research, just look me up on in Google Scholar. Just type in my name, Moyers T, and you'll be able to see some of the research that I've done. And come to my website,
Yes.
teresamoyers.com, to find out, what I'm up to these days.
Yeah, Terri, thank you once again for being willing to talk with me. It's been really wonderful to catch up.
It's been great talking to you, Stan. And listen, best of luck with your work.
Thank you very much.
All right.